sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for. When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth. In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I mean, I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
La da 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 da. Hey, folks. Welcome back to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Ethan Nash, and with me today is me, myself, and I. I'll be doing a solo podcast here today. These are one of my favorite kind of conversations where I just get to talk, everybody else has to listen, and nobody can interrupt me. It's great. So, thank you for joining today if you're listening to this episode. Today, I am going to take a pretty nerdy deep dive into the topic of motivation, and specifically, what motivates employees? How do we go about motivating employees? But it's something that I've really taken a deep dive into over the last several months. Because there was so much attention to this topic of motivation and motivating teams, motivating employees, I really wanted to kind of get down to the nitty-gritties of, what does the research indicate about how we go about motivating our workforce? And so if you're kind of a nerd for this stuff like I am, well, you're in good company. So let's get into this. What motivates employees? Right? We need to really think about what will actually motivate employees. I want to start by just highlighting some research. So for the past several decades, from what I understand, the most comprehensive surveys of attitudes towards work find that about 50% of American workers confess they only do the very minimum to avoid being fired. And 80% of employees admit that they could work much harder. So if we want to improve the performance of our organizations and improve the performance of our work teams and individual workers, which tends to improve morale and engagement, which tends to make people more satisfied in their jobs, we need to really understand what motivation is, what demotivates people, and what motivates people and work teams. Let's talk for just a brief moment here about really what motivation is. I mean, that might seem pretty obvious to people, but there's actually some fair distinctions between motivation and other types of emotional driving forces. It pushes us to start something new, or to restart something we've stopped, or to persist towards a specific goal in the face of other distractions and all the competing priorities that we have. So in general, the literature defines motivation as making progress on three different fronts. The first front is just starting. When we refuse to start something new, right, or something that we haven't done for a while, this is called active choice motivation failure, a failure to start. There's also persisting motivation, okay, to persist at a goal, to persist towards moving towards that goal. So when we stop working on something that's important and switch our attention to other things, they call this persistence motivation failure, right? Failure to keep persisting towards that goal. And there's also investing mental effort, another factor of motivation. So when we refuse to work smart and invest mental energy to succeed at a new challenge, and instead use familiar but probably inadequate solutions to solve a new problem, they call this mental effort motivation failure. So there's three real components to what motivation is. It's starting motivation, persisting motivation, and investing mental effort. Okay, we're all victims to these type of motivational failures. It's just going to happen. So now we need to talk about what we can do to help people work through these motivational obstacles and increase their motivational efforts towards achieving goals. Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about the brain science of motivation. Now, a lot of this research I'm pulling from the Huberman Lab Podcast. I highly recommend it. It's a deep dive into performance using evidence-based methods and tools. But basically, Andrew Huberman, professor at Stanford University, describes motivation is what allows us to pursue long-term and short-term goals. Now, that's kind of like, duh. Yeah, we get that about motivation. Now, what is going on in the brain that causes motivation or the lack thereof? The primary chemical in the brain associated with motivation is dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical in the brain that really drives motivation. But basically what happens is dopamine is released into the brain when we're experiencing things that we like. Okay, this is electrical activity in the neurons. It's a reward pathway. So when you get excited in an anticipatory way, when you're anticipating a reward, whether that is a cup of coffee you're going to have or a meeting with a good friend, then the rate of the electrical activity in the reward pathways increases by about 30 to 40 times your baseline dopamine levels. Now, this will create a sense of action and desire to move in the direction of the reward. So dopamine is responsible for wanting to do something. Dopamine is not just about pleasure. Dopamine is what causes us to be motivated to do something we believe is going to provide us a reward, right? It has the effect of narrowing our attention to the thing we believe will provide us with that reward, which may indeed, of course, bring us pleasure. So that's a little bit about what is going on in the brain with motivation. We will be motivated through different electrical activity in the neurons. Apart from that, I want to highlight that motivational researchers, from my reading, have really begun to all agree that nearly everyone is going to be willing to persist, to start, and to invest maximum effort in activities that they believe will make them more successful or more effective. So if we recognize a goal that's going to move us closer in the direction of success and effectiveness, our brain anticipates that reward. And this is what will allow us to move and take action towards that goal. So the bottom line here is that all of us really value the goals or the working conditions or the incentives that we believe will contribute to our success. And we're going to be motivated by these factors. And so, you might then ask, as I did as I was reading this, why do people have a hard time switching to, for example, a healthy diet or exercising regularly if it's so clear that it will make them more successful or more effective? Right? And as I thought about this, and this is now kind of more my belief and my opinion on this, but this is when, cognitive dissonance can overpower motivation, right? So cognitive dissonance is really a strong driving force in all of us. We can pretty easily convince ourselves that we don't need to be, again, for example, be healthy in order to feel successful and effective. Our brains want to conserve energy. So we can pretty easily make up stories of why we should not move towards a particular goal. So whether or not being healthy will make you more successful or not, that's not really the point here. I just used that as an example. The point is that we are complicated humans with complex brain systems. So I only say this to recognize that motivation is complex, right? We're going to be motivated by the anticipation of a reward, but at the same time, there's different cognitive distortions and cognitive biases that may prevent us from moving towards that goal. So now let's consider performance in the workplace. I want to take a little bit of a turn here and discuss what destroys motivation. Now, I think it's important that we start here with these motivation killers because demotivators, I believe, can really be a more powerful force than motivators. So what can we stop doing in our workplaces or with our management styles to ensure we've created the conditions for creating a motivated workforce? So here's what the research done by Richard Clark indicates about the main things that will really destroy motivation in the workplace. The first is acting in a way that is perceived as dishonest or hypocritical or just generally unfair. Now, organizations and leaders don't have to lie, to cheat, or to be unfair to demotivate people. They just have to be perceived as doing so. What we think about our own behaviors is much less important than how our behaviors are perceived by others. Beliefs can be more powerful than reality. So, if you want to keep people from being demotivated, you need to appear fair and honest. And I think the best way to appear being fair and honest is to actually be fair and honest. Now, I'm not going to deep dive into this one too much, but one way to ensure that the perception of fair and honesty is out there to your employees is something we've talked about many times on this podcast: having really good, regularly scheduled one-on-one meetings with each one of your employees. These meetings are what allows you to have the chance to meet with everybody equally, to share information they may need to feel like they're being treated fairly and well, and really just to show a lot of caring and respect for everybody. You can listen to some of our podcast episodes on one-on-one meetings. I'll link to those in the show notes. But another factor here, I think, in creating a fair and equitable and honest workplace is it's important that we, especially as leaders, work to examine our biases. How may you be unintentionally treating people unfairly? That's the thing about biases. There are biases that we know about in ourselves, and there are hidden biases. So if we can actually do some work to figure out where might be some of our hidden biases that might be causing me to treat people unfairly, even if I'm unaware of it, or even if I don't want to be treating people unfairly. So again, the first motivation killer is acting in a way that is perceived as dishonest, hypocritical, or unfair. Another big demotivator is providing unclear or impossible or constantly changing performance expectations. Vague goals lead people to believe that anything goes. And when there's no direction, people tend to be pretty unmotivated. There's some research done by Locke and Latham, and they find that just these impossible, quote-unquote, stretch goals really damage motivation. If people feel like they can't reach a goal, or if the effort needed to reach that goal is going to far outweigh the reward if it is actually achieved, people aren't going to take much action. Still, goals do need to be challenging if it's going to motivate people to perform better, which is really what we're talking about here. How do we motivate people to perform to their potential, or at least perform better? So those goals do need to be challenging, right? Easy goals, according to the research I've looked at, are not motivating. And so the research also found that work motivation increases when there are really clear, challenging, but achievable goals. And specifically, these type of goals are focused on the near term. And by near term, I mean today, tomorrow, this month. We, as humans, we don't do a great job of anticipating reward for super long-term goals. We tend to be motivated by the here and now. So take those long-term goals, because by the way, having long-term goals with your team or organization or each individual staff member, that's needed. That's important. So take those long-term goals, break them down into achievable but challenging short-term goals. All right, what does this long-term goal mean for this month? Is it clear? Is it actually achievable but yet still challenging? And what can be achieved this week? And encourage your employees to think about what can I achieve today in relation to these longer-term goals. Again, we tend to be more motivated by goals that are more in the here and now. Another big giant demotivator is imposing unnecessary rules, policies, and work processes. There are actually many studies that point to the huge variety of arbitrary, disliked, and seemingly unnecessary rules and policies as one of the major demotivators at work. So, why not ask our employees which rules they dislike the most? And if changed, would really motivate them to work harder and increase their commitment to their jobs and even the organization. For example, what is actually gained from rules that prevent people from decorating their workspace in the ways that they want to? Do we actually have solid evidence beyond our own preferences that, for example, dress codes are necessary and that they add significant value to a business or an organization? So how much of people's behaviors must we actually control to achieve our business or organizational goals? I think that's almost the North Star question to be asking ourselves. Another big demotivator is constant competition among everyone in the organization. Focused competition with competing organizations is actually very motivating for most people. Competition within an organization, from what I'm seeing in the research, produces mixed results. While some people might thrive on this type of inter-organizational or inter-team competition, for example, like salespeople, they may thrive on it. There are many instances where internal competition between individuals and work teams has actually harmed motivation and harmed the organization overall. Right? So constant and intense rivalry within an organization is most often destructive because it focuses attention and energy away from the actual business goals. There's a really interesting study done by Druckman and Bjork, or Bork. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce that correctly, Bjork. And their research was actually done with the National Academy of Sciences. And the Academy surveyed all of the research on organizational team building strategies. And so the performance improvement methods they surveyed attempted to get members of a work team to bond, to collaborate, to work efficiently towards common goals by competing with other teams within the organization. So when the Academy released the findings, it was surprising to learn that many of the most popular team building programs had succeeded in increasing collaboration and cooperation among team members. But the teams were competing, and I quote here, in a nearly suicidal fashion with other teams in the organizations. I think that's a really shocking finding because I see it all the time. Let's create competition between this department and that department, between this team and that team, or even between this employee and that employee, thinking that competition will motivate them. Right. So I really think that organizations should consider the possible unintended side effects of encouraging wide-scale internal competition. A more motivational approach to competition within an organization is to encourage people to compete with themselves by asking them to exceed their own personal best in critical areas of their job. So constant competition among everyone in the organization can harm motivation. Now, the last big demotivator is when managers point out people's mistakes and criticize them for errors. Many managers, including many that I've spoken with, seem to believe that to, quote unquote, keep people on their toes, they have to watch really carefully until someone makes a mistake and then they can jump on them and correct them for that mistake. There's two pretty comprehensive international reviews of performance feedback research. And what the studies found is that negative feedback that focused on mistakes actually depressed performance. Right? This is research done by Bandora and Locke and some other researchers as well. There's a great article, and I'll link to this in the show notes because I think it's very instructive. But an article called The Feedback Fallacy, it was in Harvard Business Review by Buckingham and Kaufman. And the article really outlines the research on what quote-unquote corrective feedback can do to motivation. Yet, let's still consider that we still do need to give feedback that is correcting of behaviors, right? Let's be realistic. We can't just give positive feedback all the time. We're here to lead others. We're here to perform as a manager. We're here to help our teams perform at a high level. So we do need to correct behavior. We do need to give corrective feedback. So what I suggest is motivate people by giving them feedback that begins with a description of what they have accomplished in terms of the goals they were attempting to reach, and then discuss ways that the gap between the two can be closed. So you start by highlighting what they have already accomplished in pursuit of this performance goals, and then highlight where they may have potentially gone astray, or highlight the behavior that if they were to improve this behavior, they would be that much closer to achieving that goal. And then partner with them to coach them on ways that they can close the gap between what is happening and what should be happening. Again, check out the article, The Feedback Fallacy, in the show notes. And so those are the 5 big demotivators. Quick summary, they are: act in a way that is perceived as dishonest or unfair, providing unclear or impossible or constantly changing performance expectations. It's imposing unnecessary rules and policies. It's fostering constant competition among everyone in the organization. And it's pointing out people's mistakes and criticizing them for errors unnecessarily. Now, let's transition out of that dark place about the motivational killers and let's get more positive. What increases motivation? There's a book that many of you probably heard of. We've talked about it many times on this podcast. It's one of my favorites. It's called Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And the author is Daniel Pink. And so this book discusses really what the research shows about motivation. And there's one particular section of that book that I think is really informative. The book highlights some research done by the London School of Economics. So the London School of Economics looked at 50 plus studies on pay for performance schemes. And I'll read you a quote now by the London School of Economics. We find that financial incentives may indeed reduce intrinsic motivation and diminish ethical or other reasons for complying with workplace social norms, such as fairness. As a consequence, the provision of incentives can result in a negative impact on overall performance. So the argument here is that paying people to do what they would do anyway switches their motivation away from a fascination with the task to the pay they're going to be promised for performance. All that said, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, is that I've seen other fairly robust research that shows when you pay people for producing more, it maybe, if they hit a certain quota, they get paid more. If they make a certain amount of sales, they get paid, or per piece they produce or per piece they sell. The research showed that has actually increased people's interest in that job. So there's some conflicting research out here on money and how it might contribute to providing people more interest in their job or more motivation in their job. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure if different research studies are defining motivation and interest in the same way. It's all pretty confusing. My interpretation of what I'm reading on money and motivation is that we should still pay people well, right? Money does matter for people. And I believe that there is a place for pay-per-performance incentive systems. But I believe where organizations run into trouble is making money the only lever they pull I do think that the research is fairly clear that money is not the primary motivator for people. What the research shows about motivation, and this is outlined again by Pink in his book, is that the source of motivation comes from three main areas. So right now we're talking high-level concepts about what motivates us, and then we're going to get practical here in a moment. So the three, I guess we'll call them buckets that motivate people are, number one, autonomy. Autonomy is the desire to be self-directed. Remember what I said earlier, that imposing unnecessary rules and policies and processes tends to be demotivating. Because what that does is it takes away from our autonomy of how to do the job. One of the bells I'm always ringing with leaders that I work with is, as much as possible, don't control how people achieve the performance outcomes. Set clear performance outcomes, and if they can get there through whatever fashion that they choose, that's going to be way better than outlining every single behavior that they need to perform on their way to achieving that. It's giving people autonomy. Now, this doesn't always work in every context. Sometimes specific steps need to be done, but I think you get the point. So autonomy is the first one. The second bucket here is mastery. Mastery is the urge to get better at stuff. Well, why do people learn to, for example, play the guitar late in life when they know that they're never going to be Jimi Hendrix? It's innate to us to want to improve, to want to learn, to want to grow. It's intrinsic. Remember what I said earlier. Imposing goals that are unattainable or impossible is demotivating, right? If we feel like we're not growing and mastering what we need to do because it seems impossible, this is going to be demotivating. So we have autonomy, we have mastery, and then lastly, we have purpose. Purpose is really just being a part of something that's bigger than yourself. There's a story that I've been told several times. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it's instructive here. There's a group of bus drivers in a large U.S. city. And there are some motivational issues, right? They asked the bus drivers, why are you motivated to do your job? You know, what meaning do you find in your job? And they really didn't find much meaning in their work. So what the leadership did was then go around and start interviewing people that rode on their buses. And they came back to the bus drivers and they reported these beautiful stories. They said, you know, you see this woman right here. She's a single mother, 3 kids at home. And without you, she wouldn't be able to get to her job on time. She doesn't have a car, right? She wouldn't be able to get to her job on time and get back to her kids. You provide so much value in her life. And they had story after story about this, of the impact these bus drivers were having on people in the community simply by allowing them to do what they need to do to live and to get by. And as it turned out, this really increased the motivation of these bus drivers. I think that's a beautiful example, whether it's true or not. But remember when I talked about the constant competition within a team or an organization, and that can be a big demotivator. I think one of the reasons why the constant competition amongst a team or an organization is demotivating is that people start to think, you know what, is there a higher purpose to this work than just out-competing others around me, right? Why does this work really matter? If the focus is just on competing with that department or that person in the organization, what meaning does that give me? So just connecting a few of the dots there. So we have autonomy, we have mastery, and we have purpose. If we can find ways to pull these levers, I think we can start really to motivate the people around us. If we can find ways to provide people with more autonomy, to help people grow and improve, and provide them a sense of purpose and meaning in their work, we're going to be in a much better spot in terms of motivating our workforce. So, where we're going to go next, let's talk about some of the universal motivators that work for everyone, right? We got the high-level stuff, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Let's get a little bit more practical and discuss what the research shows as tactics for motivating employees. And again, a lot of this research was done by Richard Clark, and he outlines, based on the research, 3 key motivators that tend to be universal. The first one is help people develop self-confidence in their work skills. This one, I believe, relates to the concept of mastery. People need to feel like they have the competence to successfully master their jobs, their new skills that they're required to learn in their jobs, or to move successfully towards workplace goals. It's important to focus on self-confidence on specific types of tasks. There's really good evidence out there that suggests that general self-confidence is not as critical for work motivation as is task-specific confidence. So when people lack confidence that they can succeed at a specific goal, they're not going to choose to tackle that goal, right? If they've started to work on the goal, they may find a way to really just kind of convince themselves to switch to less vital tasks, to maybe invest very little mental effort, or argue about their assignment. So to help people build self-confidence, I believe as managers, we must be constantly checking in with our employees to learn about their concerns. Again, I bring this back to the importance of having really good one-on-one meetings that are regularly scheduled with your employees. This is where we understand what motivates them. This is where we can understand where they might lack some confidence and how we can coach them towards developing the skills needed to have more confidence in that work task. So the first one here is helping people develop self-confidence in their work skills. The second big universal motivator is, surprise, surprise, creating a positive emotional work environment. What I find is that emotions are usually ignored in discussions about motivation, but they are really important. Positive emotions such as happiness or humor and even joy support and enhance work commitment. Yet it's not necessary for everyone to be happy in order to be committed. It's more important that people are not excessively unhappy or angry or depressed about work issues. So my belief here is that creating a positive emotional environment, based on the research I've read, is to do a few different things. Outside of, allowing people to behave and design their workplaces in a way that pleases them, I think you also have to create high levels of psychological safety on your work team. We talk a lot about psychological safety on this podcast, but this involves many things. But one of the biggest factors of creating psychological safety is having leaders who demonstrate high levels of care and respect for employees. They engage them to understand their concerns, their motives. They work to remove barriers that are getting in their way to achieving their goals, right? They treat people as humans with complex lives outside of work, and they work to foster a sense of fairness and equity. Leaders who ask for opinions and truly mean it. Leaders that ask for feedback and are open to hearing the feedback without getting defensive. Leaders that give feedback in a way that's focused on behaviors rather than throwing character words at people like you're being lazy or you're rude, or without throwing judgments at them like, you just don't care about this. Right? So there's many ways to develop psychological safety, but that's a key component to creating a positive emotional work environment. Another key component, I believe, is develop the skills in all your team members that contribute to a positive environment, right? And work with your team to create commitments to practicing these behaviors and skills. Some of these behaviors and skills includes listening really well and with respect to all your colleagues, receiving feedback non-defensively, giving feedback with clarity and respect, finding healthy ways to deal with workplace negativity, and making commitments to cut out gossip. These are just some of the skills and behaviors that would contribute to a positive and professional workplace environment. Okay, So that was all about creating a positive emotional work environment. Another big motivating factor for people in the workplace is asking people to accept and value their own performance goals. Again, we're talking about workplaces here. There will need to be performance goals, right? But there's evidence that suggests that while people don't have to choose their own work goals in order to be motivated by them, a personal intention to succeed at the assigned goals is very motivating. So look for ways to encourage people to believe that if they do make strong commitments and persist at reaching their performance goals, they're going to become more effective. But in order to do that, as you might imagine, is you need to understand each person individually and to tie their performance goals to what motivates them. So again, this is all about asking people to accept and, more importantly, I believe, value their performance goals. Now, the research points out 3 types of values for work goals. So again, understand your people to understand which type of value will motivate them to accept and value their performance goals. One type of value for work goals is called interest value. This is simple. People will more easily and quickly choose to do what interests them the most. Not exactly a shocker there. So many people are generally interested in mastering a new skill or adding to their expertise. So it can be useful to suggest connections between the performance goals of your employee and their natural interests whenever possible. So hey, here's your new performance goal. And you know what? I know you're really interested in leadership. In order to achieve this goal, you're going to need to really flex those leadership muscles, okay? And so this is a great opportunity for you to do that, just as an example. Another type of value relating to work goals is skill value. Most people are willing to do things, even if they don't like the thing, if they believe it will challenge one of their special skills. So to support skill value, I recommend suggesting connections between the performance goals and people's special abilities by suggesting that it's an opportunity to show your skills in this area. Now, another value of work goals to keep in mind is utility value. So much of what we do as human beings is chosen not because we love it or can excel at it, but because we want the benefits that come when we finish and avoid the negative consequences of avoiding or delaying it. Right? Again, bring this back to the brain science I talked about earlier. Right? Our brains release dopamine when we anticipate a reward. So utility value can be enhanced really by just describing the realistic benefits of completing a less desired task or goal, and maybe talking about the risks of avoiding that goal. Now, it's important here to not inflate either the benefits or the risks, but this might be useful, right? If you can talk about the end state with this and what that might look like. All right, so a quick summary of what we just discussed in this section on universal motivators that tend to work for everybody. Number 1, help people develop self-confidence in their work skills. Number 2, create a positive emotional work environment. Number 3, ask people to accept and value their own performance goals. And you may do so by pulling up a few different levers here, right? Highlighting the interest value in it, highlighting the skill value in it, or highlighting the utility value in it. Now, to close this podcast episode up, I want to just really, really briefly highlight what the research shows about motivating teams. What we were talking about earlier was motivating specific individuals. Now let's talk about what motivates a team, right? When you look at the whole team together, what will motivate them to achieve performance goals and to perform at a high level? There's lots of research on how to motivate teams, and I'm going to simply summarize the main findings here and really just leave you to investigate this more if the spirit moves you to do so. So there are 5 main motivators of teams in which most of the research agrees on. The first is fostering mutual respect among teammates. I think this is where things like team building workshops come into play. Workshops that are designed to get people to really know each other for who they are as human beings, so we can create a mutual sense of respect among each other, is really powerful for motivating that team. I think this is where exercises that are related to vulnerability-based trust come in. And again, I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But another big motivator for teams are the team must believe that weaker members are working hard to improve. If a team feels like there are weaker members on the team, but they're not trying to improve, that can be pretty demotivating for the whole team. However, the presence of quote-unquote weaker members on the team itself is not a demotivating factor. What is demotivating is if there's the perception that they're not trying to improve. So what can you do as a manager to help those people improve? The third one here is requiring that team members collaborate with each other. Now, again, we talked about earlier that some people try to set up competition among team members. That might work in some contexts. I've seen that it sometimes can work among sales people. But in general, if there are goals that you can point to say, you know what, in order to achieve this goal, it's going to have to be a group effort. This is going to require team members to collaborate with each other. Another piece here is holding individual team members accountable. Right? If team members are slipping or they're not following through on their commitments or whatever, and the leader's not holding them accountable, well, team members are going to start thinking to themselves, well, okay, if they're not getting held accountable, how do I know they're going to hold up their weight in achieving our team goals? If all that stuff just gets to slide by without any accountability conversations, then what am I doing here? Why should I be motivated to work hard at achieving these goals? And the last big motivator for teams is directing the team's competitive spirit outside of the team and better yet, outside of the organization. And we've talked about that already several times on just this episode, so I won't say anything more about that. So there you go, folks. That was a wide-ranging but deep dive into what the research says about motivation. Where does motivation come from? What happens in the brain? What tends to really demotivate people? What can usually universally motivate people? And what motivates teams? I do hope you got something to value out of this. If anything, I hope it at least allow you to see that there are key factors that motivate and demotivate people and teams. And I encourage you to go forward and start using some of these evidence-based approaches to motivate your team. Again, a motivated workforce tends to be one that performs at higher levels. And what I think is even more important is that when people are motivated, they're more satisfied with their jobs. And as I've said many times on this podcast, we spend huge chunks of our life in the workplace. So why not try to make it the best for everybody? All right, I'll leave you with that. Go forth and motivate. Goodbye.